There we go. Are you seeing some slides? Thumbs up if you're seeing some slides.
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay, so as I rambled a few minutes ago, the most useful skill I've ever learned is how to run a meeting, and also how to participate in a meeting that somebody else is running. This will save you a lot of time, but it will also allow you to get a lot more done with a lot less pain with more people, right? First and most important thing, we don't have to invent any of this. Please, 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 if you've got a question, go to askamanager.org. She's very funny. She's very insightful. She, I think, has a very realistic view of what's possible in large organizations. And having the perspective of a woman working in large corporate America, she sees a lot of things that people like me might overlook. So there's prior art here. Please check it out. So rule number 1, does there actually have to be a meeting? The answer is almost always no. Right? So if the purpose is to inform people, don't have a meeting. Write a blog post, send an email, put it someplace where it's searchable after the fact, where people can check it asynchronously, and where you've got time to think about what you want to say and craft it right. It doesn't have to be long. There is beauty in a 4-sentence note someplace that people can find later, provided it's properly tagged, and you're done. If the purpose is consultation, then yes, absolutely have the meeting, but only if you're actually consulting. If people don't have a vote or a veto, it's not consulting, it's informing. And a lot of consultation meetings that happen in large organizations are pretense. We're going to tell you what we've decided. You get a chance to vent your complaints, but nothing's going to change. You can't say no, you can't opt out. In that case, just skip the pretense, please, and inform people politely of what hell is about to rain down on them. If the purpose is free-form discussion, if you're brainstorming, then yes, it's worth doing, but really only in small groups. If you have 20 people in a meeting or a discussion, you either have 3 discussions going on at once, or half a dozen people are having a discussion with a bunch of spectators, unless there are well-defined procedural rules, and we'll come to that. One of the reasons that the parliamentary system works at all is that they've actually evolved procedures. And if you are an elected official in Ontario or at the federal level or in most states, you do get some orientation and training so that you understand who gets to ask what questions when, how do you bring a motion forward for a vote, and so forth. Right? You learn how to do this dance. And that structure is what allows us to have a productive meeting with a larger number of participants. Finally, if the purpose is collaboration, if you got some code to write, right, or a meal to cook, that's not really a meeting. And please don't try to mix the two. I've had some very fruitful discussions over the years while making dinner for the members of the Scottish Labour Party, right? But the whole point of that was that it wasn't an official meeting. It's a chance to have a discussion where you get to know people and you kick ideas around, and it isn't on the record. And there is a very good social use for that. Rule number 2, no agenda, no meeting. I will opt out of meetings where people have not bothered to take a couple of minutes and put together a few bullet points to say, here's what we're going to talk about. Because if it isn't important enough for you to do that, so that I know what to think about in advance, what I'm getting myself into, what's at stake, then it's not worth me showing up, right? Please try to include timings. Is this going to be a 1-minute discussion, or is this going to be 10? It doesn't, most people won't stick to those timings, but it gives everybody an idea of how important or how involved we think these issues are. If one issue is tagged as 30 minutes and another is tagged as 3 minutes, then what you're signaling to me is we expect this one to require more attention. We expect to wave this one through. Right? This allows you to prioritize things. Right? And yeah, Rohan, please add them publicly as a signal to your audience. I think one of the reasons we don't tend to make those public is that we never actually hit those targets. Right? But that's okay. Right? That's not really its main purpose. Please plan to end early. Everybody needs a few minutes between meetings. As my wife once said, the most fundamental unit of time is the bladder. And I said, I've never thought of it that way. And she said, you've never been pregnant, right? Everybody is going to need a bit of a gap for whatever. So plan for 50 minutes out of the hour. And U of T standard time, there's that 10-minute gap between classes so that you can run across campus. Prioritizing is something that comes with practice. There is a regrettable tendency to say, here's a bunch of small things, let's get them out of the way first, to leave time for the big issue. That's exactly the wrong approach. I have been in meetings where we spent 40 minutes arguing over free coffee for the staff and 5 minutes waving through a $1.2 million budget for the year, right? The big things come first because they're the big things. Number 3, clear rules for making decisions. Without this, you fall into the trap that Joe Freeman identified in the 70s, one of the most influential essays written in the 20th century, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. She was looking at early feminist groups from the 60s and 70s and pointed out that if you don't have a formal structure, that doesn't mean you don't have a power structure. It means you have one that is unaccountable. People who have power through personal connections in the old boys network like the apparent formlessness of we're all equal here, because it leaves all of the real power in their hands, right? And yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for posting the link, right? I like there to be rules so that people who might otherwise be shut out of conversations know that a conversation is taking place and how to be part of it, right? If you need to use Robert's Rules of Order, which are the rules used in the British parliamentary system, you probably want to get training, right? My father's copy is somewhere on the shelves behind me. It's 120 pages in a small paperback, but that's for running, the parliament that is running Canada. A much more effective set of rules for small groups is Martha's Rules, which evolved in housing co-ops in the United States in the 70s and early 80s. There's a link there to the paper. Basically, if you want to bring a motion forward, you write a one-page proposal where you say, here's what we're going to do, here's why we're going to do it, here are the trade-offs, here are the resources required, so that people know what they're either supporting or opposing or proposing a variation of. That has to be circulated at least 24 hours before the meeting. No surprises. And I'll tell you right now that I've occasionally dropped things into meeting because I knew there was going to be objections and I didn't want to give people time to think. It's a very, very old trick. And as a matter of fact, Catullus, the Roman author, described this as a way to get your legislation through the Senate, and that was 2,500 years ago, right? So don't let people do this unless I'm the person doing it, right? You then have what is called a sense vote. Everybody is up, down, or neutral. If everybody is up or neutral, it passes without discussion. You don't waste time on things unless there's opposition. If there is anybody in the group at all who says no, then you have a moderated discussion, typically about 10 minutes long, because everybody has seen the proposal and understands the issues at stake. The moderator should make sure that you're not simply re-presenting what is in the written proposal. People are expected to have looked that over. Right? You then have a binding vote, which is up, down, or abstain. At that point, its majority passes. Right? It is actually very rare for a proposal to have to get to the binding vote stage. Most of the time, as a result of discussion, the original proposer will go back and rework it. If you repeatedly have votes that are splitting at the binding vote stage, what you have is some fundamental disagreement about the purpose or direction of the organization. And it's good that you've uncovered that, because you might actually have two groups in one room and they should split. And I've been part of organizations where this got revealed. Right. And thinking of how Amazon works with its memos, this approach, not Martha's Rules, but the write a brief, was the heart of British civil service training, and particularly training for the Foreign Service that governed India and the other colonized territories for 200 years. Can you summarize your point for somebody who has to get through 50 hard decisions in a day is a skill that was regarded as being the core of the humanities, or of creating a legal brief. And there is a famous story, which I actually believe is true, that Winston Churchill never read past the first page of anything that was put on his desk during the Second World War. He said, if you have time to write a longer brief, it isn't actually urgent. Right? And this is a skill. Being able to boil things down to that one-page presentation is a skill that you'll find very, very useful. Here's the outline of how I would do it. You can fit all of this into one, maybe 2 pages, depending on the complexity of the issue. There are lots of examples flying around. Rowan can point you at some. This is a craft that goes back literally centuries. So, rule number 4, put someone in charge. This doesn't mean somebody has final say. This means somebody is acting to direct traffic. Ideally, it is somebody who isn't part of the organization and doesn't have a stake in it. Right? The referee doesn't play for either team. The conductor is not a member of the orchestra. Their job is to keep track of who wants to speak, to call on people in order, to make sure that they're only making one point at a time. If somebody says, well, I've got a few things that I want to cover, the response should be, great, give me the first, then we'll lap around everybody else and give you a chance for your second, because somebody else might make your second or third point just as well as you could. And we want to try to ensure fair airtime. This is one of the places where online is actually working very well. I think you can all see the chat in Zoom. Okay, so in meetings that I run, we adopt an old Unix convention. If you want to speak, /hand means I raise my hand. But if you've been in a meeting with me more than once, you will know that you're supposed to add a word or two so that I know what point you want to make, what topic do you want to speak on? Because if Lorena is presenting and 5 people raise their hand, 4 of them about budget and 1 about curriculum, I can batch up the issues to make sure that we deal with one thing at a time instead of having the conversation zinging around all over the place. Right? Simple things like that, which are facilitated by this kind of online interaction, really helps the meeting flow more smoothly. And you can spot the professionals in meetings, because while Amy is talking, I'll be making a few notes about the points I want to raise, the questions I want to ask, and crossing them off as she addresses those points or as other people ask those questions. This medium gives us a way to create a shared backlog, which I think is more efficient. Number 5, all the other rules are actually a special case of this one. Okay? We require politeness. That doesn't just mean please and thank you. No technology during in-person meetings. I make an exception for assistive technology, but nobody can multitask. And I am sure you have been in meetings where somebody made a point of being busy on their phone or their laptop in order to demonstrate that they were really above this meeting, right? Half of my attention is all you plebs deserve, okay? We don't do this. Now, I notice that right now, most of you have your cameras turned off. I have no idea if you're multitasking. I don't know how to address this. I can't require you all to turn on your cameras. I have no idea what your domestic situation is. I can't require you all to share your screens. I wouldn't even if I could. But it makes for less efficient meetings. In my experience, people are more likely to multitask in an online meeting, and that's what makes the meeting less effective. I don't know what we do about this. Yeah, you'll hear the phrase politeness mode. That means phone turned off and face down, laptop closed, right? Nobody gets to interrupt except the moderator. Right? You will often have people who want to jump in and say, but wait a second. The answer is no, you raise your hand or whatever other mechanism it is. Everybody gets to finish their point. The flip side of that is the moderator makes sure that nobody rambles. The moderator is allowed to say, you've had your paragraph, you don't get a full page, let's move on to the next person. And if somebody, and I'm thinking of a few meetings I've been in, if somebody says, well, I just want to brainstorm. This isn't really fully formed, but I think that that's the point where the moderator jumps in and says, great, we'll take the next 3 questions. You take a moment and then deliver a fully formed thought. Okay. I'm not asking for dough and a bag full of raisins. I want you to give me cinnamon buns, right? Bake this for me, please. And I presume you've got a code of conduct. Your institution probably does. If not, the organization should adopt one. It's important to have rules about what is out of bounds, right? Not just so that people know what they're not allowed to say, but so that everybody else understands that this is a place where they don't have to worry about that. People from marginalized or disenfranchised groups shouldn't have to pay the intellectual tax of constantly checking their shoulder to see if they're going to get sideswiped. Joseph Stalin was not actually president of the Soviet Union. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. He was the one who got to decide what was on the agenda, and he was the one who got to take the minutes. That is the person who has the real power. Always take minutes, right? Always have a record of the main points that were made and the decisions that were made, particularly the decisions that were voted on. People who weren't there need to know what happened. If you don't do that, you are disenfranchising people. And I have been in organizations where meetings would be held at 11 p.m. on a Friday night in order to make sure that certain people couldn't be there so that we could get motions passed. Okay? Not proud of it. The second reason is you want the people who were there to agree on what was actually said. I have come out of meetings and the next day looked at the minutes and said, whoa, I did not promise to have that done by then. Right? Ambiguity is very useful in personal relationships. I think pretty much every marriage survives and thrives on the basis of productive ambiguity at certain points. It's death in an organization where I can mean one thing and soterios can have interpreted it a different way, deliberately or otherwise. Right? I'm not suggesting that you should be paranoid, but particularly when you're crossing cultural boundaries, there's a world of difference between somebody saying, I think it would be useful if you did X, and I have just ordered you to do X, but it can be heard differently by different people who are coming from different backgrounds. So nail it down. And yes, you want people to be held accountable. If I promised Soterios that I would have something done by the next meeting, I shouldn't trust his memory and he shouldn't trust mine. We all of us have so many other things going on. Rule number 7, you got to manage that guy. And yes, it's almost always a guy, right? And Noah has a really useful little website which categorizes the sorts of people who can derail meetings and gives you strategies for dealing with them. And you can actually buy a deck of cards with these symbols on them, right? So you can be in a meeting and you can hold up that you're being shy. Like, I know that you know the answer to this one, right? Or you're being apathetic, or you're, the shark one. Diverting, the dolphin. We're not here to talk about measuring salinity of seawater, Greg. I mean, it's a fun story, but save it for the after party. Okay. Here are a few techniques that you can use. First, let me ask in the Zoom chat, do you know the 3 sticky trick for meetings? Answers, please, in the Zoom chat. Yes or no, you know what the 3 sticky trick is? All right. At the start of the meeting, everybody gets 3 sticky notes, or 3 poker chips, or 3 jelly beans. I would say 3 pennies, except when's the last time you saw a penny? Every time you talk, it costs you 1. When you are out of tokens, you are not allowed to speak until everybody has used at least 1 token, at which point we reset and everybody gets all their tokens back. This ensures that nobody is talking more than 3 times as often as the quietest person in the room. And it completely changes the flavor of the meeting. This was done to me in my second startup to get me to shut up, because I was one of those guys and yes, it's almost always a guy, who acted as if no matter how big the meeting is, I should be talking half the time. You've met my younger self, right? I'm not going to ask if any of you are my younger self, but you've met my younger self. This clears space for people who need a little bit more time, or are a little bit more introspective, or maybe struggling with language issues, whatever it is. It clears space for them to make their points. And I have actually, since I started using this rule, I have actually seen grown men pull $20 bills out of their wallet trying to buy a sticky note so that they could talk, because they're jonesing for the sound of their own voice. It's been 90 seconds since I said something, right? And across the table, there's a woman, and yes, it's always been a man and a woman, who's got her 3 sticky notes and a great big grin, because now you know what it feels like to not be heard. Okay. Interruption bingo. Start of the meeting, draw a little bingo card. Everybody's name goes on each row and each column. Every time I interrupt Rohan, you put a tick in the appropriate box. Every time Rohan interrupts Satirius, you put a tick in that box, name versus name. After about 20 minutes, you'll see that the same 2 or 3 people are doing all of the interrupting, and they're only interrupting people that they perceive as having lower social status than themselves. Funny story. A lot of my stories aren't true, but this is a true story. A pre-tenure prof, female, at Stanford started doing this in meetings and started reporting how frequently various people interrupted. The university's response was stop collecting that data. Okay. Many people who do things like this are unaware that they're doing it. Once they're aware, they can either try to correct it or they can carry on. In either case, you've learned something useful about the person. Right? And I know you don't have time for reading because Ryan is such a taskmaster. Please, for the love of all you hold holy, go and get this book. Right? Stephen Brookfield is one of the great teachers of our time and a very warm humanist. This is a collection of 50 different ways that people can have productive discussions. It's a catalog book. Right? Of the 50 patterns that he and Steve Preskel describe, I had only ever seen 15 used. And I've been doing this for, well, 42 years. Right? And of those 15, I'd only ever seen 5 or 6 implemented in software. There's huge scope for simple tools that will make discussion better. Engineers don't build them because they've never seen them, so they don't know to build them. Slack is just, IRC is just the old Unix talk utility, but with more emoji. Right? For example, there's a non-programming group that I'm involved in, and several years ago, we instituted a rule, borrowed straight from this book. 1 message per person, per topic, per day. What we were finding was, like, I would wake up in the morning and there would be 85 messages back and forth between 2 people in Europe about some subject, and I would just opt out. It's overwhelming. Like, I can't catch up. I can't get in, right? So depending on your time zone, you're systematically shut out of certain conversations. Once we put a throttle rule in place, we're making space to invite contributions. Let me ask again in the chat, do you know what the Pac-Man rule is for conferences? Answers please in the Zoom chat. Okay. Whenever you're standing in a group, you always stand so that there's 1 empty space, so that there's room for somebody to come in without having to elbow their way in. If you've got 4 people, you occupy the 4 positions of a 5-person circle. If you've got 5 people, you add, but you always leave 1 empty space. And if you take a look at some of the research that's been done, people are far more likely to go and join a group when there's a place. Right? So it means that you're opening up the discussion to participants who don't have pre-existing social ties or aren't super self-confident. Right? The digital equivalent of that is an interesting thing to experiment with. Our throttling rule isn't quite this, but it has much of the same effect. It makes space. Diving back into the slides. Rule number 8, no passive participation. Right? If I'm running the meeting efficiently, you don't have an excuse for zoning out because it's going to be over soon, right? Can I ask in the chat, have you seen the fan cut of The Hobbit? I know that's an odd question. Peter Jackson made 3 movies and they were awful, right? A fan cut it down to 2.5 hours by throwing away everything that wasn't in the original book and made a much, much, much better movie, right? So if somebody's gone to the effort of cutting it down, you can bloody well sit there and eat your popcorn and enjoy the movie, right? So feel free to decline invitations if you've got nothing to contribute, as long as you accept in advance that you will be bound by the decisions made by the meetings you chose not to attend. If you can't attend because of some other commitment or a family responsibility, that's one thing. But if you opt out, right, it is the same as choosing not to vote. You don't get to complain about the result of the election if you didn't take part and could have, right? Read the agenda of the material before the meeting. The rule at Amazon is the first 10 minutes of each meeting are spent reading through the memos. I strongly object to that, right? Because again, it works against people who don't read as quickly, who have poor language comprehension skills. I like to have time to digest. People who are privileged and self-confident like racing against the clock. It puts power back in their hands. People who want more time for reflection, I think we should respect that. It also means that in Amazon style meetings, you can't do background research, you can't fact check. You've got 10 minutes to plow through these. I like having stuff 24 hours in advance so that I can go and search and see, wait a second, you have completely misrepresented that result that you are now using to back up your case, right? Those of you who are on Twitter may have seen an exchange overnight. Steven Pinker, fairly famous public intellectual, quoting a paper to show that both conservatives and progressives in the United States are equally likely to subscribe to conspiracy theories, except the paper explicitly says exactly the opposite, right? But you need time to fact check, and you don't have that if you've got 3 proposals to read in 10 minutes in the meeting, right? Take your own notes. I don't always save them. I take my notes in order to organize my thoughts. And as I said, I'll take notes and cross things off as they're being addressed. Address participants by name so that people know who you are talking to and when a response is expected. Again, this helps a lot across cultural boundaries as well. Pause before speaking. You can actually look fairly intelligent if you stop for a moment before answering a question, right? As long as the moderator has already indicated that you're the next one to speak, taking a moment or two to marshal your thoughts actually creates a good impression. It doesn't make you look indecisive. And as a side note, if I had learned to pause before answering questions, I would probably have been married several years sooner than I was, but that's a different story. Finally, if somebody has made a point you were going to make, please put down your hand. When the moderator calls on you, say, no, it's been taken care of, right? Again, the point is not equal airtime. The point is equal contribution. Yeah, we're still trying to figure out online. All of this is tentative and some of it's probably wrong, but this is what we do right now. First, no mixed mode meetings. Not much of an issue with COVID, but once things get back to life before, if you have a mixed mode meeting, the people who are remote are tremendously disadvantaged no matter how hard you try. The rule at the company I currently work for is that if any one participant has to be remote, everybody is remote. So you might have 3 people in the same building going off to find quiet corners because the 4th can't be there, and you want a level playing field. A good moderator can obviate some of this. If you have a moderator who can keep things on track, you can level a lot of this off, but it does take work. No recording. I'm not going to ask, but In a group this size, the odds are good that at least one of you has at some point been on the receiving end of online harassment or abuse. And the prospect of video of yourself escaping your control is probably pretty frightening. So unless there's a really good reason to record it, you don't. And even then, make sure you have everybody's definite assent. Right? Review the meeting protocol at the start if it's a new group. If you're meeting regularly and you've all internalized the rules, that's fine. If the membership is changing, if it's been a while, a 1-minute rundown, just to remind people that this is how we play this game. I take minutes in a shared document. Right? I always have a Google Doc open or a HackMD, it used to be Etherpad, so that people can see the minutes emerging as it's going along. Yeah, it helps. And it does kind of break the no technology rule, but particularly for online meetings, I know people are breaking that anyway. You're on a video call, pretty sure you're using technology for that. So I might as well give you something to look at. And we talked about raising hands digitally. And finally, and I wish I could go back to my younger self and smack him upside the head over some of these points. The purpose is truth, not victory. Many meetings degenerate into social dominance displays. Right? And you can well actually yourself into a pretty unpleasant corner. Again, this is part of what the moderator is supposed to do. And there is a fine line between shutting somebody down because they're trying to score points and shutting somebody down because they're struggling to make their point. And I obviously don't want the moderator to exclude people from the conversation. And yes, we have to be aware, not just of cultural differences, but of people who are neuroatypical, people who are differently socialized. Right? This one's hard. That said, don't raise a point you don't believe in. The devil does not need more advocates. Don't throw it on the table just because theoretically that there might actually be somebody who comes in and wants to do X, Y, and Z. If you don't think it's likely, we've got other things we need to talk about. And I don't think you should make excuses for your questions, but I don't think I'm going to change you. Many of you have been culturally conditioned to apologize for having an opinion. And yes, that breaks down along gender lines, class lines, racial lines, and so forth. I used to fine people for this. Right? I would fine people if they used the word just when they were explaining something. Oh, it's easy. You just, refrobnicate the Franistan. Duh. Strong implication that you're an idiot for asking the question. Okay, throw $1 into the swear jar. And somebody's, well, this is probably a really naive question, but it's like, no, throw $1 into the swear jar. Now ask your question. I never actually changed anybody's behavior this way. Right?